Today we're going to be talking about Marissa Kennedy. Marissa's story is shocking because there were so many hotline calls trying to save her. Neighbors, doctors, therapists, teachers were all deeply concerned. I have talked about Maine DHHS in so many cases, and this just so happens to be where this case is from. And this is not intentional. This is nothing against Maine. I typically go off of members suggested, and it just so happens that so many of them are from Maine. So between a weak system and a stepfather blaming mental health and having an answer for pretty much anything, this brings us to the story of Marissa. Marissa Ann Kennedy was born on October 29, 2007 in Middletown, New York, to her mom, Sharon Kennedy. She lived with her mom and her grandparents, Roseanne and Joe Kennedy. She was a happy child who was cherished by everybody that lived in this happy home. Sharon had some mental deficits and her IQ was tested at 70. So she had some issues, but she was able to get a job at Walmart. It's always Walmart. And Marissa was well taken care of. Her grandpa says she loved to swim, read, dance, build Legos, watch movies, and attend car shows. He said her smile would light up a room. Her grandma says she loved the color purple, the movie Frozen, and every dollhouse in the world. This brings us to when Sharon met Julio Carrillo. He was a coworker at Walmart. Her parents said that they really liked Julio in the beginning, although he had some mental deficits as well. It seemed like they could be a happy couple, a happily ever after. They married in July of 2015, and then they moved to Maine. They had 2 more children after they moved to Maine. But once they are in Maine, though, Child Services and the police started receiving calls about the Kennedy Carrillo household. These calls came into the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, or DHHS, but going forward, we're just going to call them Child Services. On October 17, 2016, Child Services received a report about Marissa. The caller was from Marissa's school, and they were saying she had missed the last 5 days of school. And this will be an ongoing trend that Marissa would miss a lot of school. It just so happens that 9 more calls came in before the next one that I'm going to talk about comes in. It gets a little repetitive for your sake and to keep it moving. I'm not going to go through every single call. There was 30 of them. It's a lot. The calls were made from the school because Marissa would miss multiple days or a week at a time. Therapists were calling because they didn't think she was getting proper care. And a neighbor was also calling because she heard shouting and loud noises coming from Marissa's household. So Marissa is assigned a child services caseworker to investigate these claims. On May 31st, the caseworker called and came to the house twice unannounced, but no one would answer the phone or the door. When Sharon called back later that day, they made a plan to meet the next day and for the caseworker to interview Marissa at school first and then meet them at the rest of the family back at the house. Just after the call, though, Sharon must have hung up and started thinking, and she calls back, and she tells the caseworker that Marissa had a nervous condition and wouldn't talk to people she didn't know. Sharon asked her if her and Julio could be there when Marissa is spoken to. The caseworker explained she would need to speak to Marissa privately. On that same day, another report was made by a neighbor. On May 31st, yet another report was made by the neighbor. She said that a few days earlier, the police had been called to the home because of Julio hitting Marissa twice in the leg while they were getting into the car. She said Sharon was also in the car and witnessed it as well. The neighbor said she wanted to make sure Child Services knew what was happening. She also said that they heard Julio yelling and the other members crying all the time. So the next day, the caseworker did meet with Marissa at school and the rest of the family at Marissa's home. But Marissa, she wasn't comfortable talking without her parents, she would say. When the caseworker tried to talk to her about more, Marissa just stared at her and said nothing. She seemed to be shaking at times during the interview as if she was really nervous or scared. The caseworker asked Marissa what her parents had told her, about this interview, but she said she didn't know. After that interview with Marissa, the caseworker talked to the teachers as well. They talked about her and Marissa's ongoing absences and that her parents hadn't let her go on any field trips the whole entire year. They also said that the parents had requested a different school for the next year. And this is scary, right? Because this school is involved trying to do the best they can to help Marissa. But, of course, the parents want to hide and isolate, so they're looking at a different school for the following year. And the parents, Marissa's parents were interviewed separately. Sharon said that she was worried about Marissa's mental health, but when the caseworker asked for a release to talk to Marissa's primary care doctor, Sharon said she would have to talk to Julio because they make all their decisions together. When the caseworker asked why they didn't let Marissa go on any field trips, Sharon said they were worried about Marissa passing out because of her low weight. When she was asked about the reports of fighting and yelling at the house, Sharon said that she would sometimes yell, scream, and curse. She said that she knew she shouldn't do it in front of the kids, and she was worried about her own mental health. She said she planned to find a doctor to help her with this. Julio denied hitting Marissa and said he had no idea why anybody would report that to the police. He also denied any physical discipline, but he would hold Marissa during a tantrum to calm her down. He said Marissa's absences from school was because the doctor appointments that she needed to keep, but also the teachers were pulling Marissa from class to talk about things that she really didn't want to talk to, making it hard, and Marissa wants to avoid going to school because of this. And I just think that's a total manipulation. Like, if they would stop bothering her to see what's going on with her, then she would go to school. No, I don't think so. When asked about field trips, he said Marissa had doctor's appointments and that she just didn't want to go on them. He did finally admit to yelling after the multiple reports of a man yelling from the house, but of course he denied any DV. The pair also mentioned that they were being evicted and were looking for a new place to live. But I have to wonder if that had anything to do with the neighbors. The neighbors are onto them. They're hearing this noise and they're making the reports. I wonder if they were looking for a new place because of the neighbors trying to get involved. After the interviews, where I see a million red flags, the caseworker stated no findings or signs of danger, but a lot of worries about DV by Julio. Because of all the reports of him yelling, being controlling, and not letting Marissa or Sharon meet with people alone. The caseworker then spoke with an assistant from Marissa's primary care doctor. She was told the doctor had concerns about medical neglect because the family wasn't following up on doctor's recommendations for mental health. The same day, the caseworker spoke to Joe Kennedy, which is the grandpa of Marissa. That's Sharon's dad, Joe Kennedy. He said he hadn't been in much contact with the family since they'd moved, but that in New York, Marissa and Sharon had lived with them and his wife for many years and helped raise little Marissa. He said that Marissa had become cold to them when they saw her. Apparently, Julio was very controlling and wouldn't let Sharon talk to her parents unless he could monitor the call. The caseworker told Joe that there was not currently a reason for Child Services to have an open case with the family, but the assessment period was 35 days. The caseworker also told Joe that Marissa wouldn't talk to child services or school personnel because other than that, she was doing good in school. Where in the world did these caseworkers come from? Joe, on this call with the caseworker, did say that he was going to be in Maine in 2 weeks and would be happy to meet with the caseworker. 5 more calls come in. This brings us to September 5th. By this time, Child Services demoted Marissa's case to a low risk and transferred her to an ARP division and assigned her an ARP worker. ARP stands for Alternative Response Program. Quick explanation here. The Alternative Response Program was created by Maine's DHHS at the state level in order to partner with child services at the local level and to investigate allegations of child abuse and neglect. The reports that are sent to ARP tend to be those that DHHS has determined to be low, moderate risk, not high risk at all. On September 5th, the ARP worker was finally in touch with Sharon, and she said she would call him back. Then Marissa's new therapist called to say that she had been given written permission to speak with Sharon's stepmom about Marissa. Apparently, Roseanne said that she was worried Julio and Sharon were not giving Marissa her medication and that the family seemed to be struggling to parent 3 children, partly because of Sharon's intellectual impairment. The family offered to help Julio and Sharon. They even offered to allow Marissa to come stay with them, but nothing came of it. She also said that Julio appeared to have become paranoid. During the month of September, Child Services tried 6 times by phone and by mail to get in touch with Sharon or Julio, with no luck. On October 3rd, a therapist working with Marissa called Child Services again to report that Marissa had been hospitalized 4 times since July of 2017 and that Julio and Sharon did not follow up with recommended outpatient or inpatient home services. The reporter said that the parents had participated in family counseling when Marissa was inpatient. When she was in the hospital, the parents did participate. But other than that, nothing. And that Marissa had been diagnosed with autism. Again, the ARP worker called Sharon and left a message. This was on the 8th. On October 9th, Child Services was contacted by the therapist that was supposed to meet with Julio and Sharon that day. But Julio called and canceled due to illness. However, in the background, the therapist heard screaming. The therapist asked Julio if everything was okay, and he said that Sharon was in crisis. So the therapist tells Julio to either call the police or take Sharon to the ER to be evaluated. He agreed to take her to the ER. Who knows if he actually did? On October 10th, the ARP worker left yet another message with no return call. So of course, on the next day, the 11th, the case was closed due to the client refusing services. But I'm sorry, since when is abuse and neglect of a family optional? Okay, but we're just going to move on. Stockton Springs Police Department contacts Child Services on October 18th to report that Sharon was having mental health issues and threatening to hurt herself while holding a large kitchen knife. The younger kids were there. The younger kids are witnessing this. The police said Sharon had been transported to the hospital and was waiting to be evaluated, and she also was 2 months pregnant. This report was referred to ARP. So again with ARP, Sharon is holding a large kitchen knife, threatening to hurt herself, and this is not enough to open an actual case? On October 20th, the ARP staff went to the home and finally met with Julio and the 2 younger kids. The ARP staff had been trying to get a meeting for over a year now. Julio told the ARP worker that Sharon had a bad tantrum and was in the hospital because of it. He also said that Marissa was getting treatment in a residential program What program, you ask? He's not saying. Julio did assure the worker that there was already a plan in place to get Sharon counseling once she is released. I'm guessing the brand new ARP caseworker had no idea that Julio lies to every person he talks to. I could not verify that Marissa was actually inpatient anywhere. It is possible that she was, and it is possible she was there in the house and Julio did not want her to be interviewed because possibly she was injured. But Julio accepted the ARP's services and both the younger children appeared safe. So on the 26th, the ARP staff finally met with Sharon because now she's out of the hospital. Julio was at work, but Sharon called him to talk about housing, and he said he was planning to call a shelter. Sharon signed all the releases the ARP worker needed. She said that she had an appointment the next day to set up a new primary care doctor and therapist. She also said that she had set up therapy for Marissa. She said that her and Julio had a very strong, supportive relationship with no history of DV. Oh, and both of the younger kids were great too, rainbows and butterflies. So obviously Sharon can lie just as easily as Julio. But this new caseworker buys the story and is happy as a clam. Then, on November 13th, the ARP worker tried to call Julio and Sharon, but the number was disconnected. And again, on November 16th, the ARP worker tries to call. Yes, you get the idea. But eventually on November 27th, when she shows up at the house, Julio does come to the door and says that the family just spent 12 days in a shelter. So you're living at a house, you move out for 12 days to go to a shelter, and then you're back at the house? But I'm not even sure if that makes sense, but maybe they came up with the money and they moved back in. It's really bizarre. And whoever bought that with no explanation, I have no idea. But while she's there, while this worker is there, she tells Julio that the case manager they told her was handling their case doesn't exist. No one by that name works there. Of course, Julio corrects her and says that, oh no, I gave you the wrong agency. Let me give you the new agency. So they sign new release forms for this other agency. At this point, Marissa was also at home and they said she would be going back to school the next day. The next month, December 6th, the ARP worker meets with them again. She says again that she can't seem to get any information on the treatment that the family is getting. Julio says that Marissa and Sharon are both getting support and they have a case manager and a counselor through yet another provider. They sign new releases. It's like they do this dance every time. It's almost as if they're not seeing the abuse because they're so involved in the mental health treatment and signing new releases that they're not focusing on the big picture. Is Marissa safe? It's just my prediction. I don't know. I'm just saying, just outside looking in. But anyways, Julio reported that Marissa had been to the ER twice over the weekend, but she was fine now. And I believe this was because of tantrums, I guess. January 4th, 2018, a new call was made to Child Services by a doctor in Sharon's primary care provider's office. The report said that Sharon had been hospitalized on January 3rd for wanting to hurt herself. The therapist said that only Julio and Sharon were at the hospital, and the doctor was told that the younger children weren't home when Sharon had the crisis. This person wasn't aware of any abuse or neglect, but wanted to make sure that Child Services knew what was happening in the home because of the young kids and Sharon being pregnant. Absolutely nothing. Nothing happens. Then several times the ARP worker tries to schedule an appointment in January. Originally, the appointment was for the 9th, and when the ARP worker called the case manager to get Sharon and Marissa's records, she finds out that they aren't patients there yet again. The appointment was for the 9th. It was rescheduled for the 12th. Then on the 11th, Sharon called to say that she couldn't meet with the ARP worker because she had to see her therapist instead. Eventually, the ARP worker and the therapist talked and realized that Julio and Sharon are constantly lying, and no one at all was providing services to the family. Sharon had only seen a therapist twice since December of 2017, and this is January of 2018. Okay, so it's only a month. It doesn't seem like a long time, but Sharon has threatened to hurt herself many times. This whole time, they were supposed to be evaluating the family for abuse and neglect, but they're all wrapped up in this mental health issue. Not saying that it's not important, but so at the end of January, they start the dance all over again. Do not forget, this is optional. Not once has the state of Maine substantiated abuse or neglect, although it seems many people were trying to alert them. On January 23rd, 2018, the ARP worker met with the family for the last time. Sharon, Julio, and Marissa were all there. The 2 young kids were sleeping. Marissa sat next to Sharon and appeared weak and tired. She had a bruise and small scratches on her left eye. The worker even saw bruises on Marissa's arms. Julio tells the worker that Marissa had been seen by Crisis for hurting herself. What is she, punching herself in the eyes? The worker tried to talk to Marissa, but between Julio not allowing it and her being so darn tired, that didn't happen. Of course, Julio blames that on medications. This guy has an answer for everything. But hey, they sign new releases again and new referrals and access to doctors' files, and the ARP worker leaves completely happy again. There were 30 calls to Child Services Hotline. 30 times they could have saved this young girl's life. Instead, they let the stepfather paint her as a mental case and cause self-harm. All this time, Marissa's grandparents, who had helped raise her, were still living in New York, but Julio would not let them talk to her. He always had an excuse. Marissa's outside playing with friends. Marissa's taking a nap. Always something to avoid they couldn't talk to her. On February 25th, 2018, Julio calls 911 to report that 10-year-old Marissa had been found bleeding and barely breathing in the basement of their home. First responders and law enforcement officers that arrived found Marissa already not breathing. The police interviewed both Sharon and Julio. Sharon said she didn't know what happened. Maybe Marissa had fallen and hurt herself while watching Despicable Me downstairs. But Julio, in the other room, was telling a different story. Julio said they both regularly beat Marissa. They would scratch, punch, kick, hit her with a belt, a mop, make her kneel while Sharon stood on her legs. He told everything. So then, after knowing all this information, they interviewed Sharon again. They told her what Julio had said and asked her what really happened. So she tells the truth. And it was true. They had forced Marissa to kneel naked on kitchen tiles and raise her hands above her head while she was hit repeatedly with a belt in her stomach and ribs. She was beaten almost daily. About 2 weeks before she had died, they switched the weapon out for a metal mop, which Julio used to beat her across her ribs. He beat her so much that the metal handle broke off of this, and she would scream and cry for hours. This is probably what the neighbors heard. After a really bad beating on the 23rd of February, just 2 days before she died, Marissa told her mom, "I feel like I'm dying." Shortly after that, she stopped moving and her speech became slurred. Neither the mom nor dad got her help. They thought Marissa had been pretending, so they attacked her again. When they realized she wasn't faking, they hatched a new scheme. They staged the basement and made it look like Marissa had accidentally fallen, and then called 911 and said that they found her unresponsive, bleeding from her mouth. They said that she was playing in the basement, and when they found her, she had fallen, they believe. Even after telling the truth, as they were tried for her murder, they each tried to claim that Marissa was violent towards herself and the other family members. Investigators found no blood in the basement, but they did find blood around the chair in the kitchen, behind the toilet, and in Marissa's bed. There was bruising on her stomach and swelling above her eye. The medical examiner found that Marissa had endured broken bones, blunt force trauma, hemorrhaging, lacerations, and abrasions, including her internal organs. She also had infections, traumatic lesions, intense pain, chronic stress, and hair loss, and ultimately, she had heart failure. When he testified, he explained to the jury what contusions, lacerations, and abrasions were. It was very difficult testimony to listen to. He showed pictures and videos that the parents took of Marissa being beaten and her bruises and the contusions after. The jury wiped away tears, but ultimately, Julio was charged with Marissa's death, and it was depraved indifference murder, and he pled guilty to receive 55 years in prison. Sharon Kennedy, she divorced Julio and took her maiden name back, pled not guilty. During her trial, the photos and videos were shown. The jury found her guilty of depraved indifference murder, and she was sentenced to 48 years in prison. The judge agreed with her attorney that she had been a victim of Julio's abuse also, and that this is why she received a little bit less time than Julio. After the murder of Marissa, the state of Maine's DHHS really had to investigate how they were handling calls for help. Child Services also opened a case after her death. They substantiated allegations against Sharon and Julio for emotional abuse, neglect, and physical abuse of Marissa, and the threat of physical abuse and neglect to their younger two children. The department was granted custody of the younger two kids and the baby. The baby came as Sharon was in jail. The two younger kids have gone to live with Julio's parents. I am not sure if the baby is still in care or if she has been placed with a family as of today, and I really hope so. This is another tragic case that is eerily familiar to many other cases I've covered. Let me know your guys' thoughts, and let's leave a purple heart for Marissa. Thanks to all my channel members and Patreons who continue to support me. Their names are on the screen. If you would like early access to new videos and decide the cases that I cover next, you can do so by clicking the join button from your desktop, or there is a video on how to do it from your phone in the description box. Well, if you guys have made it to the end, you guys are rock stars, and I love you to death. There are more true crime videos in my Crimey Stories playlist for you to check out. Stay safe, my loves, and as always, remember, if you see something, say something, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.